Let me take you on a journey back in time. The year is 2015. If you were sitting down to game, you were probably checking out some of the new RPGs like The Witcher 3, Bloodborne, or maybe checking out the new Destiny expansion, The Taken King. If first-person shooter PvP was more your style, you were probably hopping into some Battlefield Hardline or maybe Call of Duty Black Ops 3. This was a completely different time in gaming. This was even before the great Battle Royale takeover of 2017. The groundwork had started to be laid with H1Z1's Battle Royale. Nobody knew what was about to happen in that genre. The point is, games had been pretty similar to each other up until this point. If you wanted single player, there were a lot of action RPGs focused on big open worlds and parkour movement mechanics. If you wanted first-person shooter PvP, you had your classic set of arena shooters trying to iterate on what came before them and not really innovate on the genre as a whole. And then, in November of that very same year, we saw this. A gritty, frenetic, hardcore first-person shooter that seemed to be more focused on immersion and chaos. A game where you can get snuck up on and killed instantly, a game where you limp around when you get shot in the leg, and a game that lets you customize your gun with an unprecedented amount of control. Now this could be different. Fast forward to 2017, and not a lot happened in the FPS PvP space. More Battlefields, more Call of Duties.
You want the numbers, Mason?
Ultimately, a lot more of the same. And absolutely nothing showcases gamers' desire for a new and novel experience like the meteoric rise of the Battle Royale. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, aka PUBG, released on March 23rd, and by the end of the summer, it was reaching 1.5 million concurrent players on Steam, and the Battle Royale craze had begun. And in the shadow of that, in the summer of 2017, we got this. Escape from Tarkov enters open beta in June of 2017, but the Battle Royale genre kind of overshadowed it. And to be honest, that was probably a good thing for Tarkov. Battle Royales were a much needed change of pace in the PvP space. It achieved this by combining PvP with progression. This was the secret sauce of BRs. Progression in FPS PvP arena shooters pretty much all exists outside of the actual gameplay. You would play some matches, gain some XP, maybe level up your character, level up your weapons, then you would go play more matches, maybe you would prestige so that you could go play more matches and level up some more. And sure, progressing did have some bearing on the actual gameplay. You could unlock more weapons or more attachments for your guns, but none of that progression happened in the match you were currently playing. You couldn't find that new gun you were trying to unlock, you were just trying to get enough XP so that you could use it next round. Even committing to a ranked grind in a game is largely an external progression. You want to play well so that after this match, you can rank up. Ranking up doesn't mean you have better gear, just better opponents. I promise this is a video about Tarkov. I'm getting there, trust me. Battle Royales worked so well because it brought progression into the game that you are playing right now. Everybody starts with nothing, and then you loot and fight, and hopefully you are becoming more and more powerful as the round progresses. And there are inherently high stakes involved. At any time, you could get killed by another player, and you would lose all that progression.
Action is coming. Action is coming. Action is coming.
You lost all that loot that you were gathering, and now you had to queue in and start over. And PvP was an essential component here. Being crowned the champion over the 100 people that queued in with you only works when it's real people that you now feel superior over.
Yeah!
Fighting 100 bots to be crowned the winner just isn't that compelling. They took PvP, added progression in the match you were actually playing, which created the high stakes of potentially losing that progression, which created a level of tension and stress that slowly rises as the match plays out and boils over in one last showdown to be crowned the winner. And the beauty of a Battle Royale is that it's simple. You either win or you lose, and you queue up and try again.
When you play the game of Fortnite, you win or you go back to the lobby.
And now, as a result of the flood of Battle Royales on the market, you have literally tens of millions of gamers across the world getting used to progression, getting accustomed to high stakes, and getting addicted to that tension. And then, Tarkov finally steps in the room and asks if you're ready for the big leagues. If in addition to all that, you want the final and most important ingredient to the game that will ruin your life. And that ingredient is pain. From about late 2019 through 2022, a couple of years after the BR craze started, Tarkov saw its own meteoric rise in popularity. I don't think it ever really came close to the magnitude that Battle Royales had, but it definitely had an impact. So much so that many see extraction shooters as the next genre of games that every studio wants to get their grubby little hands on. And Tarkov worked not because it was polished or optimized or bug-free. Tarkov worked because it did the same thing Battle Royales did, but it cranked everything to 11. You like progression? Well, Tarkov merged internal and external progression. In addition to finding loot that can help you throughout the raid you're actively in, you now have 250 quests spread across 11 maps that will slowly drive you insane.
Oh my God!
You like high stakes? Well, when you die, you lose all your stuff. But instead of queuing into another game where everyone's on the same playing field as you have to gear up for another raid. And if you keep dying, you get poorer and poorer until you slowly become cannon fodder for the Giga Chads. You like PvP? Well, now you get to disrespect someone you kill in a brand new way by not only taking the stuff that they found in this raid, but the stuff that they may have spent hours grinding for and add it to your stash as you slowly amass your wealth. You like tension? Well, know that in this game, at literally any moment, you can take one single bullet to the head, eyes, and lose your best gun, your best ammo, and your best armor to a scav who literally laughs at you while you hit the ground. Tarkov took everything to the extreme right after Battle Royales had primed a lot of gamers to want to see how far the rabbit hole goes. And in a hardcore, gritty, realistic aesthetic with all the gun porn you could ever dream of, and it's no wonder why Tarkov took off like it did. No matter when you joined Tarkov, whether it was in 2018 like myself or recently, we all know the feeling of being hopelessly addicted to this game, but also hating ourselves for playing it. Like an alcoholic staring into the fridge, deciding if they want one more beer.
Someone has been in my room and taken my beers away from my room.
I don't think so.
We too stare at our monitors looking at the killed in action screen going, just one more raid. Now, I take you on this journey for a few reasons. One is to remind you of how much Tarkov really did change the face of PvP gaming right after the Battle Royale genre did the same thing. And two is to assert that in its very nature, Tarkov has always been hardcore. And now we're at the present. Tarkov generated a lot of buzz, both positive and negative, by announcing and detailing their recent hardcore wipe. And on the surface, it seemed like Tarkov was doing what Tarkov does, dialing the challenge up to 11. And it was even kind of touted as a way to get back to the roots of what Tarkov used to be. But the more they explained it, the less sense it made to me. The changes they were making didn't seem like old Tarkov, and it didn't seem hardcore. It didn't seem like they knew what that meant, or at the very least that my definition of hardcore was different than theirs. Because to me, Tarkov had always been hardcore, just used to be less annoying. So the question is, why did we need a hardcore wipe? And specifically, why did Battlestate Games think we needed one? To understand this, we have to understand what's been happening to Tarkov over the past few years. And I think I might have figured it out. It all starts with this question. Has Tarkov gotten easier or harder? Now, if you're newer to the game, you're gonna have to bear with me here because I think this is actually at the center of what BSG misunderstands about Escape from Tarkov. If you've been playing Tarkov for a while, you probably had a visceral reaction to me asking that question, but I am here to say that Tarkov has gotten easier and harder, and it got old. It all depends on how you look at the game. Let me explain. In a lot of ways, I would say the mechanics of being inside an Escape from Tarkov raid have undeniably gotten harder over the years. We got mag packing animations and healing animations, which dramatically changed fights. And yes, I remember when people said that these were going to ruin the game. We got inertia and the weight system, which made movement so much more clunky and hard to deal with. We got the found and raid system, which made questing harder. They added multiple rounds of restrictions trying to impede real money trading, or RMT, which meant that now there are limitations on what you can drop and how much you can drop to your friends, which had some interesting side effects like items being deleted from the game so that no one can loot them in certain circumstances. Also, it goes both ways, meaning there isn't just a limit on how many things you could drop, but also how many things you could hold. We've all seen the videos of people finding 3 or 4 LEDXs on labs and having to leave some of them behind because you're not allowed to carry that many. We also got a lot of secure container restrictions. Even before the hardcore wipe, the secure container was the most restricted it had ever been. Back in the day, you could put literally anything in there, but now there are restrictions on guns, helmets, cases, thermals, and even certain keys. And in addition to all of those mechanical changes, the amount of items and quests in the game have gone up tremendously, which means that finding any one particular item is harder since the pool of items in the game is so much larger. Also, just in general, you need an insane amount of items now. Like, look at these guides of things you need to save for the Hideout or quests or for Kappa. It's crazy. Also, at any given point, you now have maybe 20 to 30 unique quests at a time, all telling you to go to different places to find different items and kill different things. Now, I am not saying that any or all of these changes are necessarily good or bad. Some of them were well received, some of them maybe even necessary, and some to this day are viewed as the biggest fumbles of all time.
Okay, what are the chances?
I am just saying that a lot of those things have made the experience of being in raid harder or more tedious. There are a few things that have happened over the years that have made raids a little bit easier, such as the addition of surgical kits or stims, but I could make a whole video on the stims and their relation to the weight system and how when BSG tries to balance things by nerfing the Giga Chads, it always disproportionately affects the casuals more, but I'm already fighting for my life with this script, so just go watch my weight system video if you want my thoughts on that. Ultimately, those are some of the ways that Tarkov has gotten harder, but in addition to all those changes, Tarkov has also gotten a lot easier because there are more ways than ever to avoid or bypass all of the friction of Tarkov, including those previous changes I just mentioned. First and foremost is the flea market. This changed looting forever. Now, any item in the game could be converted to rubles, and then those rubles could be converted to any item in the game that you wanted. Now, it's gone through many iterations. The found and raid system that was added to balance the flea has always been convoluted, to say the least, and we've even had them toggle off and on that found and raid flea a couple times. They've continued to try to balance it over the years by restricting high-tier ammo and high-tier armors off the flea, but it undeniably completely shifted the way people think about looting and making money in the game. The flea market was the moment where looting in Escape from Tarkov became less about what you need and more about what sells well. The second thing that allows you to bypass much of the friction of Tarkov is the Hideout. The Hideout introduced crafting, which allows us to craft things that are sometimes otherwise unpurchasable, like certain ammos. It also allowed us in many cases to directly craft the items that we need for our quests so that we don't need to go find them. And since items crafted in the Hideout are considered found and raid, it was another avenue to turn items that we can buy off the flea market into found and raid items that we can then sell on the flea market. It also introduced the concept of passive income to Tarkov. Not only could you be crafting a ton of things at once that you planned on selling, but the Bitcoin farm meant that as long as you had fuel in your generator, you were making potentially millions of rubles a day without doing anything. Finally, the Hideout introduced things like the Scav Case and the Cultist Circle, which are ways of potentially getting some of the rarest items in the game, once again, without having to find those items. Instead, you just leave it up to chance.
Oh, chat, I sacrificed a Lega coin.
And moving on, we have the last Infinity Stone in the proverbial Infinity Gauntlet of making Tarkov easier, Arena, which instead of focusing on making money or getting quest items, Arena allows you to fully progress your character's level and soft skills without having to play Tarkov. And your reward for doing so is a trader that sells some of the best gear, best guns, best cases, and best ammos in the game without having to level up the other traders to get it. And of course, in addition to that, you can also send the millions of rubles that you make from playing Arena to your Tarkov character as well. These three things allow the player multiple ways to get money, gear, quest items, and even player progression without having to play any actual raids. Now, you do have to play raids to get some of these things set up, like getting to level 15 to unlock the flea market or getting the items to build your hideout, but maybe, just maybe, that's why people like early wipe Tarkov. Because it's a brief period in time where not only is everyone on a level playing field, but it's also a time before all the ways to skip the friction of the game have opened up. Again, I'm not saying that we should get rid of these things or that any of them are inherently bad, but I think that after going through all this, if we revisit the question, has Tarkov gotten easier or harder, we can see things a little clearer. It's hard to answer that question because it seems like the game has gone in both directions, and it has done that without an obvious cohesive vision for what the game is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be hard? How hard is it supposed to be? And in what ways is it supposed to be hard? Are you supposed to be able to skip what makes it hard? And how many times can I say hard in one rant before things get weird? Recently, I was watching the Game Maker's Notebook podcast that Nikita was featured on, and he was asked how he takes into consideration suggestions from the community and how he then balances that with what he wants the game to be. And his response was this.
You need to not like step away. You need to ease the stress. Because in my perspective, in my vision, Escape from Tarkov is way more harder than now. Way more.
Respectfully, what the f does that mean? Given everything that we just talked about, what do you think he means by way harder than it is right now? I'm not saying we should do this, but to me, if I was trying to make Tarkov way harder than it is right now, I would change, restrict, or remove the things that allow you to skip all of what makes Tarkov Tarkov, and I definitely wouldn't make it harder by tripling the amount of wires you need and only allowing you to play 3 maps. I have a really hard time understanding what he means by this. It just seems like such cognitive dissonance to me to say you want the game way harder than it is right now when Arena exists the way it does. And I don't hate Arena. I actually think it's in a pretty good spot. But the connection it has to Tarkov is busted. You want the game harder, but you gave us ways to gain levels, skills, money, gear, weapons, and ammo without playing a single Tarkov raid. I just don't get it. Another thing I think is worth bringing up here is how I mentioned earlier that Tarkov got old. Or maybe a better way to put it is that Tarkov got figured out. And I think this might be the most misunderstood aspect of this whole thing by Battlestate Games, and maybe a big reason that they thought we needed a hardcore wipe. Tarkov is a game that unashamedly tells you nothing about what's going on. I mean, just look at what Skier sells. If you are brand new, like, what the hell is all this stuff? I still don't even know what half of it does. The knowledge barrier, whether you love it or hate it, is a huge part of the game and a huge part of what made the community so tight-knit. We were all figuring this out together. But what happens when you figure it all out? What happens when there's a wiki page for every quest, when there's an interactive map for each location, when every damage value and armor material gets data mined, or every skill progression formula and money run gets figured out? And I know it kind of sounds depressing, but I really don't mean it that way. I don't think it's a bad thing that there's a wiki or maps or ballistic calculators. I think those things are awesome, and I use all of them to get more enjoyment out of Tarkov. But I think the point is that once a game largely gets figured out, it can sometimes feel easier. The difficulty of the game maybe remains unchanged, but your knowledge and mastery of it increase such that you are successful more and more often. And that manifests in the game maybe not feeling quite as challenging. And this is kind of what I mean by Tarkov got old. It's been long enough to get figured out, and so it did. And I think that this is one of the things that the developers don't quite understand. They want the game to feel hard. So they increase how many rubles something costs or how many screws you need for a quest or a hideout module. But that doesn't make the game harder, because we've already figured out how to get more money or more screws. What it really does is make the game more annoying, because those changes are not challenging in any meaningful way. It doesn't feel good to keep searching random duffel bags until you find all the screws you need. And I worry that as long as they're trying to claw back how the game felt back in the day by arbitrarily increasing the difficulty of meaningless tasks, they kind of get the worst of both worlds, because the game doesn't become any less figured out, but it does slowly become less fun. And the second part of this is just the novelty of Tarkov kind of slowly wearing off. And this is unavoidable, and it happens in every genre and every game that's gotten popular. This isn't a slight against BSG or anything. Tarkov was the first extraction shooter, and it blew our friggin' minds because we had never seen anything like it before. But after 8+ years of the game being around, at some point, some of that novelty is just gonna naturally wear off. So, over the years, Tarkov has definitely gotten harder, but also definitely gotten easier, and for sure it's gotten figured out. So what now? Well, I think that explains a lot of the confusion and division in the Tarkov community. Two people might say, I wish Tarkov was more like it was back in the day. One of them wants that because Tarkov was harder back in the day, because there was no Flea and no Hideout and no Arena. The other one wants it because it was easier back in the day, because there was no inertia, no weight system, and there was actually loot to find in raids. And both of those people probably don't realize that part of what they miss about back in the day is the fact that Tarkov was so fresh and new and hadn't been min-maxed yet. Nobody knows what back in the day means anymore. And I think that this confusing, jumbled mess explains a lot of the changes that Battlestate Games have made over the years. It seems like each of the major changes was implemented in a vacuum, without really thinking about how they affect the larger game as a whole. And then over time, they are kind of forced to react to how all of those mechanics affect the game and affect people's perception of the game.
I was like, I don't know, like, I just want to play video games and that's it.
The Hideout is a great example of this. There were a ton of quests in the game before the Hideout that were super hard and like RNG to do. Then, when the Hideout came, there were suddenly recipes to craft a bunch of the things that were hard to find, which was awesome. But then those tasks kind of became super easy because you could just craft what you needed. So they added more hard tasks. And then when those tasks got too difficult, they added more crafting recipes. So then those tasks became easy. So then they added more tasks, and round it goes. Instead of taking a beat to consider how some of these tasks could be rebalanced so that they were still challenging, but maybe more accessible or less reliant on RNG, we just end up with an increasing number of fetch quests, an increasing number of crafting recipes that all just feels like bloat. It doesn't feel like they've taken a 10,000-foot view of Tarkov and laid out a clear vision for what it's supposed to be. And since Nikita himself was saying that the hardcore wipe was a way to get back to the roots of Tarkov and make things feel like the old days, let's now finally take a look at what actually happened in the hardcore wipe. Here are most of the major changes that were made to the game for the hardcore wipe. There's no time to go through all of them individually, but I think there are some really interesting observations to be made here, so I've grouped them into 3 buckets: contradictions, arbitrary changes, and things that had potential. The first bucket are the mechanics of the hardcore wipe that seem to contradict each other or undermine each other. The limited hideout crafts and limited trader inventories seems to imply that this wipe was going to put a greater focus on finding things you needed in raid. But instead of rebalancing the available loot on the locations and behind keyed rooms to make up for the lack of flea and lack of things available from the traders, they actually nerfed loot. It kind of felt really cool those first few days to find a key because you thought maybe this would be a great way to find some meds or some ammo or some stuff you couldn't buy. But the amount of times I looted a locked room and there was literally nothing inside was really deflating. The reduced sell price and increased buy price from the traders, the increased insurance costs and repair costs, kind of seemed to imply that money was going to be much harder to come by this way. But they left the ability to transfer money from Arena, meaning anybody with Arena could kind of skip that ruble pressure because they could just farm an unlimited amount of money risk-free. Many of the hardcore changes made it seem like the spirit of the wipe was to keep high-tier gear and ammo rare. But the bosses were at 100% at the start of the wipe, and what was purchasable from Ref was still extremely high-tier ammo, armor, and guns. Their solution, by the way, to people complaining about how you could get some of the best stuff in the game from Ref wasn't to meaningfully balance what was available from him. It was just to make those things more expensive. Also, I think the bosses being at 100% is a really interesting example of a really confusing change. Any other wipe, increasing the boss spawn percent on wipe day would have been a massive W. Even in the hardcore wipe, if they had just made it 50% from the start, it would have been a really welcome change that most people would be excited about. But since it started at 100% and then dropped to 70% and then dropped to 50%, the people that enjoyed it at 100% were now frustrated, and a lot of the damage had already been done to the economy. It completely undermined the spirit of the wipe to have them at 100%. Whether you liked the ability to get high tier gear early or hated it, I don't think anybody understood how this could be considered hardcore. To experienced players, some of the bosses are pretty easy to kill. On the second day of the wipe, I got a class 5 armor and I got a Tagilla helmet, and went on the longest survive streak of my Tarkov career, surviving 36 raids in a row before I died. And on the flip side, to inexperienced players, not only are the bosses hard to kill, but now you had a bunch of experienced players role-playing as the bosses. It was a huge influx of the type of gear that it seemed like they didn't want us to have for the hardcore wipe. It just didn't feel like they thought about it any farther than, bosses are hard, this is a hardcore wipe, make the bosses 100%. Now, let's move on to the second bucket of changes, the arbitrary challenges. In this bucket, I have doubling the item requirements for the hideout zones, insurance being 10x the price, no quests on wipe day, time gating trader levels, increased repair costs, increase the amount of money you need to spend with the traders to level them up, and the trader restock times being in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 hours. These things definitely made Tarkov harder to deal with, but they weren't challenging in any meaningful way. It didn't feel rewarding to overcome any of these challenges. They were just kind of roadblocks. Some of these things, however, could have been cool, but just needed a little bit more thought or nuance. It kind of felt like we were using a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. For example, relying less on insurance is actually a cool idea, and I think a lot of people could get on board with it. But why bait people into spending their entire net worth insuring their first kit on their first raid? They could have just turned insurance off, or they could have had insurance prices scale with party size, so that way solos could still utilize it, but it would be less of a crutch for squads. Also, wanting to slow down progression is totally understandable, but just waiting for a tweet to tell you that level 3 Peacekeeper is available takes so much of the joy out of leveling up and progressing your character. They could have just rebalanced what was available from the traders so that as people progress, they don't have access to super high tier gear instead of just arbitrarily time gating them. And then moving on to the last bucket, we have the things that were actually pretty cool or at least had some potential. Obviously, not everybody liked the secure container changes, but it was something that seemed to get a much more positive reception. And this is something that I would potentially call a hardcore change. It forced you to risk more, but it also rewarded you for overcoming a challenge. If you killed a PMC and you got to loot them, you got to loot all their meds and ammo. Now, I do think that not allowing money in the container meant that some low-hanging hardcore fruit was never attained. This would have been the perfect wipe to focus more on taking car extracts or taking the BTR around or extracting some of your loot from the BTR or at the transit extracts, but not being able to put money in your container meant nobody was really bringing enough money to partake in these things. Speaking of the transit extracts, the forced map transits at the start of the wipe were horrible, but it felt like almost everybody agreed there was a nugget of a good idea in there. It was just poorly executed. There were so many cool community suggestions during that first week that would have been awesome to be implemented, but instead they just removed the mechanic altogether. Also, it's worth noting that the bugs with the transit system were borderline inexcusable. Crashing, spawning on top of other teams, the Alt F4 bug, and all of the other transit-related bugs had all been in the game for over a year. The entire time the transit mechanic had been in Tarkov, those bugs had been present, and none of them were addressed before the wipe, and it just completely ruined the vibe. The last thing in this bucket was them getting rid of the flea market. This was probably widely regarded as the best change that they made. Not everybody liked it, but it felt like a meaningful change where there was one less way to rely on getting money or items that you needed. And it affected everybody equally. Unfortunately, as we stated earlier, they didn't really take the time to then balance what was available from the traders or adjust the loot pools in Raid to create a cohesive looting experience. They just kind of turned off the flea market. And then, eventually, turned it back on and arbitrarily made the level requirement 35. So that's the hardcore wipe. And look, I'm not trying to shit on BSG or the concept of a hardcore wipe or the people that have had fun playing Tarkov during the hardcore wipe. Honestly, even while writing this script, I'm almost embarrassed that I can muster up thousands of words of opinions on a video game. Sometimes I even tell myself to go touch some grass, but we gotta land this plane, so let's recap. Tarkov made huge waves when it started blowing up. There was nothing on the market like it. And over the years, Battlestate Games has constantly made some aspects of the game harder and opened up more ways to skip what makes it hard. And I think that them not realizing this has created a cascade of reactionary changes manifesting in a million little buffs, nerfs, and other tweaks that led to a lot of confusion as to what Tarkov is and what it was back in the day. So BSG devised up the hardcore wipe, which ultimately fell short of making really anybody happy because it too lacked a clear vision for what it was supposed to be or feel like, and it seemed like there was no consideration for how the changes being made would impact each other or how they would impact the game as a whole. All in the name of being hardcore. But I'll say it again. To me, Tarkov had always been hardcore. Let me ask you something. When you first started playing Tarkov, whether that was years ago or just recently, how did you describe it to your friends? I can only speak for myself here, but for me, it was a lot of those things we talked about earlier. The fact that when you kill somebody, you get to take all their stuff, which means if somebody kills you, you lose everything you have on you. The fact that you could literally disassemble every single part of every single gun in the game and customize it however you want with real world parts. The fact that no matter how geared you are, you can almost always get one-tapped, and how you can actually go fully broke and lose everything, or make it big and get rich. I remember telling my friends about how you have to manipulate your gear like you do in real life. You have to have space in your rig for your mag when you reload. You have to repack those mags with ammo one at a time, ammo that you have to remember to bring. You didn't just have an HP bar. Your HP was split into multiple zones, which creates an incredibly complex medical system. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Those are the things that make Tarkov hardcore. Not how many motors you need to upgrade your hideout, or the fact that it takes 60,000 rubles to repair a gun when you can just buy a brand new gun for 40,000 rubles. These things come across as annoying, not hardcore. What makes Tarkov hardcore are the core pillars of gameplay that have always been there. Maybe if they focus on providing less ways to skip playing the game and made playing the game less frustrating, you wouldn't need a hardcore wipe. The game would just be hardcore and fun. And while I do think that there is a lot of value in looking backwards to see what was working before, or to maybe see where things went wrong, I don't think that there should be so much of a focus on trying to return to old Tarkov. I'm sorry, Nikita, but to a certain extent, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Why are we worried about old Tarkov? Why aren't we focused on the future of Tarkov? Now, I don't really have some super compelling point to end this video with. I don't think that I have all the answers, and I don't claim to know exactly what BSG should do. And honestly, in this video, I was trying to avoid really giving my opinion on which direction Tarkov should go. There will always be disagreement, and no game can make everybody happy. In Tarkov, there will always be the milsim gamers versus the arcadey gamers. There will always be the casuals versus the no-lifers. I am not trying to say that Tarkov should go in the direction that I want it to go in. My goal is to outline that they created a lot of that division by going multiple directions at the same time and constantly stumbling over themselves. I just want them to pick whatever direction they want to go in and create meaningful, well thought out changes that push the game in that direction, even if it's a direction I don't like. And when you have Nikita saying that he wishes that the game was way harder than it is now, or saying that if he could go back and do it all over again, he would never add the flea, it's obvious that even they aren't completely satisfied with the direction of the game. I just want it to be cohesive and to be intentional. And yeah, there is a lot of hype around Tarkov announcing their 1.0 launch in November. And maybe 1.0 is the answer. Maybe all this was just the appetizer and they have been cooking on the 1.0 branch to the game and they've got it all figured out. I would be happy to be the first one to announce that I was wrong and that BSG was in control the whole time. But I can only really comment on what's actually happened so far. And the fact that all of this change and identity crisis has happened so close to 1.0 definitely has me a little concerned about how cohesive their vision is going to be for the launch of the game and beyond. I'll end with this. Fun and hardcore are not mutually exclusive. Tarkov has always been hardcore. It's just that Tarkov used to be more fun. But god damn it, I still love this game and I'm still rooting for it. Thanks for watching.